An island lying just off the coast of Africa speaks a language whose closest relative is spoken more than 4,000 miles away, on the island of Borneo. Madagascar sits in the Indian Ocean, just off the eastern coast of Africa. Its nearest neighbors are African. Yet when you listen to the people of Madagascar speak, you are not hearing an African language at all. Malagasy belongs to the Austronesian language family, the same family spread across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Despite Madagascar's closeness to Africa, Malagasy is structurally and lexically closer to Southeast Asian languages than to the African Bantu languages spoken nearby. That is the puzzle. How does an island off Africa come to speak a language whose roots lie thousands of miles to the east, across one of the widest stretches of open ocean on Earth? For a long time, that question had no firm answer. The distances involved seemed almost impossible. But the story was hiding in three very different kinds of evidence: in words, in genes, and in the burnt seeds left behind in ancient soil. And when researchers finally lined those three lines of evidence up, they pointed in the same startling direction. Part 1. Following the words. Language was the first clue, and it was a loud one. Linguists classifying Malagasy did not place it among African tongues. They placed it deep inside the Austronesian family, specifically within the Southeast, or East, Burrito subgroup. The Burrito languages are not scattered across the Pacific. They belong to the island of Borneo. And within that group, one language stands out as the closest living relative of Malagasy: Maanyan, spoken in southeastern Kalimantan, on Borneo. Think about what that means. Of all the thousands of languages on Earth, the nearest cousin of the language spoken on Madagascar is found on an island on the far side of the Indian Ocean. Multiple dialects of Malagasy are spoken across Madagascar today, unified under a standard based on the Merina dialect, which serves as the national and official form. But underneath that diversity lies a single deep origin, and that origin points east. The words alone, though, could not prove that people actually made the journey. A language can travel through trade, through contact, through a handful of speakers. To know whether an entire founding population crossed the ocean, researchers needed to look inside the people themselves. Part 2. 30 women. That is where genetics entered the story, and the answer it gave was extraordinary. Researchers built maximum likelihood models from genetic data to estimate how, and by whom, Madagascar was first settled. The results favored a settlement roughly 4,200 years ago, making Madagascar one of the last major landmasses on Earth to be reached by humans. But it was the size and makeup of that founding group that stunned everyone. The modeling favored a very small group of women, on the order of just 30, and around 93% of that ancestry was Indonesian. 30 women, a founding population you could fit into a single room. And that raised a haunting possibility the researchers named directly, that this was a small, possibly unplanned, transoceanic crossing. Not necessarily a grand fleet of colonists, but perhaps a tiny group carried across thousands of miles of open water. Hold that image for a moment, because it raises an obvious question. If the ancestry was overwhelmingly Indonesian, and the closest language relative is on Borneo, then who exactly were these people? The genetics had given a size and a direction. It had not yet given a home. Part 3. The Trading Post. To pin down that home, researchers turned to genome-wide data, a far finer resolution than earlier studies, and it led them to a specific people, the Banjar of southeast Borneo. The Banjar emerged as the most probable Asian source of the Malagasy gene pool, but the Banjar themselves tell a layered story. Their ancestry reflects a Malay trading post admixture, Malay traders mixing with the local, autochthonous Maanyan population during what researchers describe as Indian Ocean proto-globalization more than 1,000 years ago. This detail solves a smaller mystery buried inside the larger one. Remember that Maanyan is the closest linguistic relative of Malagasy. Yet the Maanyan people themselves show little direct genetic link to the Malagasy. How can the language be so close while the genes are not? The trading post explains it. Malay traders mixed with the Maanyan at a post in Borneo. The language of that region traveled, but the people who carried it westward were this blended trading population, not the Maanyan alone. Words and genes had taken slightly different paths from the same corner of Borneo, but there was still a third witness to call, one buried in the ground. Part 4. Seeds in the soil. The third line of evidence was neither spoken nor genetic. It was agricultural. Archaeologists examined 2,443 crop remains gathered from 18 different sites across the region. If Madagascar had simply been settled from the nearby African mainland, its early fields should have grown African crops. They did not. The African sites were dominated by African crops, as expected. But Madagascar, along with the nearby Comoros Islands, was dominated by Asian crops instead: rice, mung bean, and Asian cotton. These were the plants of Southeast Asia, growing in the soil of an island off Africa. Researchers called this the first archaeological signature of the westward Austronesian expansion, physical proof, held in ancient seeds, that people from the Asian world had brought their entire agricultural package across the ocean and planted it here. Now, 3 independent lines of evidence, language, genes, and crops, all pointed the same way, east toward Southeast Asia. But the crop study also turned up something that complicated the neat picture, a detail that opened a new question, just as the old one seemed solved. Part 5. The Comoros Puzzle. That complication was the Comoros. The same Asian crop signatures, the rice, the mung bean, the Asian cotton, appeared in the Comoros Islands too. And yet the Comorians are different. They speak African languages, not Austronesian ones, and they do not visibly carry Southeast Asian ancestry in the way the Malagasy do. So here you have a place where the crops traveled, but the language and the ancestry, as we see them today, did not follow in the same pattern. It is a reminder that these ancient movements were not simple, single events. They were tangled: trade, contact, migration, and settlement, layering over one another across the Indian Ocean world. The 3 lines of evidence usually agree, but they do not always trace exactly the same path, because words, genes, and plants can each travel on their own. There is also a question of timing. The linguist Adalar in 2017 proposed that a distinct Malagasy speech community had already formed in South Borneo before the migration to East Africa. If that is right, the language may have begun splitting off before the ocean was ever crossed, the split predating the journey itself. The story, in other words, is still being refined. Part 6. What the evidence holds. So what have we actually learned? 3 separate disciplines, working with completely different materials, converged on one of the most remarkable transoceanic migrations in human history. Linguistics traced Malagasy to the Burrito languages of Borneo, with Ma'anyan as its closest relative. Genetics found a tiny founding group, around 30 women, overwhelmingly Indonesian in ancestry, arriving about 1,200 years ago, with the Banjar of southeast Borneo as the most probable source. Archaeology confirmed it, with Asian crops rooted in Madagascar's earliest soils. No single line of evidence could have carried this alone. A shared language might be explained by trade. Shared crops might be explained by exchange. But together, language, genes, and seeds, all pointing back to the same corner of Borneo, they build a case that a real population made a real journey across thousands of miles of open water. It is worth holding on to the humility in this. The models speak in probabilities, not certainties. The Comoros still puzzle. The exact timing of the language split is still debated. This is not a triumphant unmasking of a people. It is the patient reconstruction of a human story that its own descendants live inside today. The Malagasy language, in all its dialects, remains the living voice of that crossing, a language of Southeast Asia, carried across an ocean and spoken now off the coast of Africa. If any part of this story of migration, displacement, or belonging weighed on you, please reach out to someone you trust or a local support line in your area. Help is available, and you do not have to sit with it alone.